Billionaire helps a homeless woman. Then learns she was the scientist everyone betrayed. At exactly 4:57 a.m. every Tuesday and Thursday, Jonathan Mercer drove the same route through downtown Seattle. The streets were almost empty. Only delivery trucks, city buses preparing for the morning rush, and the occasional coffee shop employee unlocking doors before sunrise disturbed the silence. Jonathan preferred those hours. By 7 o'clock, his phone would become a battlefield of board meetings, investor calls, legal briefings, and acquisition reports. Before dawn, the world still belonged to people who had nowhere else to be. Or nowhere else to go. Jonathan Mercer was 48 years old. Founder and CEO of Mercer Dynamics, one of America's fastest-growing artificial intelligence infrastructure companies. His company was valued at nearly $9.4 billion. His office occupied the top 12 floors of a glass tower overlooking Elliott Bay. His private penthouse stood only 6 blocks away. He owned 3 homes, 2 yachts, and enough stock options that financial magazines estimated he earned more in 1 hour than most families would see in 5 years. None of it had made him happy. His wife, Claire, had died 4 years earlier after a long battle with ovarian cancer. Money had bought specialists, private hospitals, experimental treatments, flights across 3 countries. None of it had bought more time. Since then, Jonathan had developed a routine. Wake at 3:45. Read until 4:30. Drive himself to the office. No driver. No security escort. Just silence. Silence was easier than sympathy. That Tuesday morning, light rain covered Seattle in a thin silver mist. Streetlights reflected across wet sidewalks like broken ribbons of gold. As Jonathan waited at a red light near Pioneer Square, he noticed someone kneeling beside a public recycling station. A woman. She wasn't digging frantically. She wasn't making a mess. She worked with remarkable precision. Plastic bottles into one bag. Aluminum into another. Glass separated by color. Green. Brown. Clear. Every movement looked practiced. Measured. Almost professional. The traffic light turned green. Jonathan drove away. Yet 30 seconds later, he found himself checking the rearview mirror. She remained there, working with quiet concentration while the rain soaked through her faded blue jacket. Something about her didn't belong. Not because she was collecting recyclables. Because of the way she carried herself. Her posture remained straight despite the heavy bags. She wore inexpensive clothes, but they were spotless. Even her worn hiking boots had been carefully cleaned. People surviving day by day rarely had energy left for details. This woman still cared about details. Jonathan dismissed the thought. By 5:12 a.m., he was standing inside his office on the 36th floor. Coffee in one hand. Seattle stretching beneath him. Then he noticed something surprising. From this height, he could still see her. She followed a pattern. Always the same sidewalks. Always the same direction. Never doubling back. Never wasting movement. She wasn't wandering. She was following a route. His operations director often said that efficiency leaves fingerprints. Jonathan suddenly realized. Whoever that woman was. She thought like an engineer. For the next 6 mornings, he watched. Never intentionally. At least that was what he kept telling himself. She appeared almost every weekday. 4:58, sometimes 5:01. Never later than 5:05. She spent exactly 87 minutes covering 8 city blocks before disappearing toward the waterfront. One morning she paused beneath an awning during heavy rain. Instead of resting, she removed a folded notebook from her backpack. She didn't write words. She drew charts. Small graphs. Columns of numbers. Percentages. Arrows connecting locations. Jonathan frowned. People tracking recyclable routes didn't usually create performance analytics. Unless that wasn't what the notebook was originally for. The question followed him through every meeting that day. During lunch, while executives discussed quarterly revenue, Jonathan barely listened. He kept seeing that notebook. Those charts. Those careful calculations. That evening he searched public employment databases almost absent-mindedly. Environmental consultants. Urban recycling researchers. Municipal sustainability projects. Nothing. Thousands of names. No face. No answer. Still, the mystery stayed with him. Across the city, the woman folded the same notebook before entering a small transitional shelter near Harborview Medical Center. Her name was Dr. Elena Brooks. 3 years earlier she had directed one of Washington State's largest freshwater restoration programs. She held a doctorate in environmental engineering from the University of Washington. Her research on industrial water purification had been cited internationally. Her team had restored nearly 40 miles of polluted river habitat. Governors had quoted her reports. Universities invited her to lecture. Students asked for photographs after conferences. Now, no one recognized her. Except a little girl named Lily. 7 years old. Curly brown hair. Too curious for the circumstances she lived in. "Did you find enough today?" Lily asked quietly. Elena smiled. Almost. Almost had become her favorite lie. She counted bottles after Lily fell asleep. $28.40. Enough for tomorrow's bus pass. Enough for breakfast. Not enough for an apartment. Not enough to escape. Not enough to rebuild. She opened the notebook again. Only this time, the charts weren't about recycling. They were job applications. 53 applications. 7 interviews. 7 polite rejections. Reason never stated. Pattern always obvious. Once employers learned she was living in transitional housing, the conversation changed. Qualifications no longer mattered. Experience disappeared beneath assumptions. By midnight she closed the notebook. On the inside cover, beneath years of calculations, one sentence remained written in permanent marker. Data tells the truth, even when people don't. She whispered those words every night. Not because they gave her hope. Because they reminded her who she used to be. Outside, rain continued falling over Seattle. Neither Elena nor Jonathan knew that within 1 week, a single accident involving a torn backpack and one forgotten research binder would connect their lives forever. The following Thursday began like every other. Seattle woke beneath another blanket of gray clouds, and a cold wind swept through the narrow streets between old brick buildings. Jonathan Mercer followed his familiar route toward Mercer Dynamics headquarters, his mind already occupied with an upcoming board vote that could determine the future of a $2 billion acquisition. He barely noticed the traffic. Barely noticed the rain. Until something unexpected happened. As Elena crossed the intersection near Occidental Park, a sudden gust of wind ripped through the street. Her worn backpack, already frayed from years of use, caught the force like a sail. The old zipper burst open. Papers exploded into the air. Hundreds of pages spun across the wet pavement like frightened birds. Cars slowed. Some drivers cursed. Others simply drove around the mess. No one stopped. Except Jonathan. Without thinking, he pulled his black sedan against the curb and stepped into the rain. A security guard from a nearby office shouted something about traffic, but Jonathan ignored him. Loose documents scattered beneath parked cars. Several landed directly in puddles. Jonathan grabbed the nearest stack before the rain could destroy it. At first glance they looked like engineering reports. Complex diagrams. Chemical filtration systems. Flow rate calculations. Hydrology models. Not something anyone collecting bottles would normally carry. He bent down to retrieve another folder. Across the cover, in faded blue letters, he read, Washington Freshwater Restoration Initiative. Principal Research Director, Dr. Elena Brooks. Jonathan froze. His eyes shifted toward the woman frantically gathering papers several yards away. She looked nothing like the confident scientist pictured on the faded employee identification card that had slipped from the folder. The ID photo showed a woman in a navy blazer, smiling during what looked like a conference. Hair perfectly styled. Professional. Confident. The woman standing in the rain now looked 10 years older. Not because of age. Because life had exhausted every ounce of certainty she once carried. She hurried toward him. I'm so sorry, she said, breathing heavily. Those documents are very important. Jonathan handed her the folder. You should probably replace your backpack. She offered a tired smile. I've been planning to. Neither of them laughed. For a brief moment they simply looked at one another. Jonathan finally asked the question that had been growing in his mind for days. You're Dr. Elena Brooks? She hesitated. It had been months since anyone had called her doctor. Finally she nodded. I used to be. Jonathan frowned. Used to? She carefully placed the papers back inside the damaged backpack before answering. Titles disappear faster than people think. Then she thanked him again and started walking away. Jonathan watched her disappear into the rain. Something about that answer refused to leave him. Back inside Mercer Dynamics, Jonathan couldn't concentrate. During the executive meeting, charts filled enormous digital screens. Revenue projections. Market expansion. International partnerships. Yet every graph reminded him of the notebook Elena carried each morning. Finally, he interrupted the presentation. Postpone the acquisition discussion. The room fell silent. His chief financial officer blinked. Excuse me? I said postpone it. But investors are expecting. They can wait. The executives exchanged confused glances. Jonathan almost never changed schedules. Especially not because of instinct. But this morning instinct was louder than spreadsheets. By noon, Jonathan's executive assistant entered his office. You asked for background research. She placed a thin folder on his desk. There wasn't much left online. Jonathan opened it. The first article dated back 7 years. Environmental scientist leads historic river cleanup. Another. Governor honors Dr. Elena Brooks for water restoration innovation. Then another. Federal grant awarded to university research team. Every headline featured Elena. Awards. Interviews. Scientific breakthroughs. Then. Nothing. 3 years of silence. as if she had vanished. Jonathan looked at the final page. One small local newspaper article. No photograph. Just 6 paragraphs. Wildfire destroys Brooks' family home. Husband critically injured. Insurance dispute continues. Research funding suspended. Jonathan kept reading. Her husband had survived the fire. For nearly 18 months. Multiple surgeries. Constant rehabilitation. Insurance companies challenged nearly every claim. Medical debt multiplied. Research grants were cancelled after prolonged absence. Eventually, the university replaced her. Her husband died before the legal battle ended. By then, everything else had already disappeared. Jonathan leaned back slowly. He knew financial collapse. He understood market crashes. But this wasn't failure. It was erosion. One impossible day followed by hundreds of smaller losses. Until nothing remained. That evening Elena visited the public library. Not to stay warm. To print 3 more resumes. The librarian recognized her. Still applying? Elena smiled politely. Someone has to say yes eventually. She folded the applications with careful precision. Every page looked perfect. No wrinkles. No stains. Presentation still mattered to her. Even if nobody else noticed. As she prepared to leave, the librarian handed her a sealed envelope. It was delivered this afternoon. There must be a mistake. It has your name. Elena looked at the envelope. No return address. Only 4 typed words. Please don't give up. Inside was a prepaid interview voucher for a professional employment center, and exactly $100 in cash. No signature. No explanation. Across town, Jonathan Mercer stared through the glass walls of his office at the lights reflecting over Elliott Bay. He hadn't signed the note. He hadn't sent the money. Which meant someone else had also noticed Dr. Elena Brooks. And whoever that mysterious person was. They already knew far more about her than he did. Jonathan Mercer couldn't stop thinking about the anonymous envelope. He had spent years believing that every major event could be explained by logic. Markets moved because of numbers. People made decisions because of incentives. Companies rose or collapsed because of strategy. But anonymous kindness? That rarely appeared on balance sheets. The following morning he arrived downtown earlier than usual. 4:42 a.m. The streets were still almost empty. He parked across from the recycling station where he had first noticed Elena weeks earlier. At exactly 4:58, she appeared. Same blue jacket. Same careful steps. Same determination. Only this morning, she seemed more tired than ever. Jonathan watched as she stopped beside a public bench, removed a folded sandwich from her backpack, and quietly placed half of it beside an elderly man sleeping under a blanket. She never woke him. She simply continued walking. A few blocks later, she handed one unopened bottle of water to a street musician setting up his old guitar. Again. No conversation. No expectation of gratitude. She barely had enough for herself. Yet she kept giving. Jonathan suddenly understood something. She wasn't surviving because she had become cold. She was surviving because she refused to. Instead of driving to the office, Jonathan followed her on foot from a distance. Nearly 2 hours later Elena arrived at Harbor House Transitional Shelter. As she entered the building, Jonathan remained outside. The shelter manager noticed him. "Can I help you?" Jonathan introduced himself. I'm looking for information about Dr. Elena Brooks. The manager studied him carefully. If you're a reporter, she's already said no. I'm not. A debt collector? No. A lawyer? Jonathan smiled slightly. No. The manager folded her arms. Then why are you asking? Jonathan hesitated. Because he honestly didn't know. Finally he answered. I think someone made a terrible mistake. The woman looked at him for several seconds before speaking. You're 3 years late. She invited him inside. Harbor House was clean but overcrowded. Families shared tiny rooms separated by temporary walls. Children colored pictures at folding tables while volunteers prepared breakfast. Nothing resembled the stereotypes Jonathan had imagined. No chaos. No violence. Only people trying very hard to begin again. The manager poured 2 cups of coffee. You asked about Elena. Jonathan nodded. She's one of the strongest people I've ever met. She opened a small file cabinet. We keep emergency records for residents. She removed a thin folder. Most people arrive here asking for help. Elena arrived asking how she could volunteer. Jonathan looked surprised. Volunteer? She teaches math every Wednesday. Science every Friday. Helps adults prepare resumes on weekends. The manager smiled. Half the people living here have better resumes because of her. Jonathan stared silently. She also repairs broken laptops. Fixes children's school projects. And every month she secretly leaves grocery gift cards under other families' doors. Jonathan frowned. How? With money she earns collecting bottles. The words hit Jonathan harder than he expected. Someone who owned almost nothing. Still found ways to give. That afternoon Jonathan instructed his assistant to dig deeper. Not into Elena. Into the wildfire. Within hours a private investigator arrived. The official story doesn't add up. Jonathan leaned forward. What do you mean? The investigator spread several documents across the desk. The fire destroyed the Brooks residence. Insurance denied full payment. Claimed electrical negligence. Jonathan nodded. So the state investigation later determined the fire actually began because of defective utility equipment. Jonathan frowned. Then why wasn't the claim reopened? It should have been. It wasn't. By the time the investigation finished, the insurance company had already declared bankruptcy. Jonathan remained silent. The replacement insurer accepted none of the previous liabilities. Jonathan looked at another report. What about her research funding? Cancelled. Why? Missed reporting deadlines. Jonathan shook his head slowly. She missed them because her husband was in intensive care. Correct. And nobody granted an extension? The investigator looked down. They technically could have. They simply didn't. Jonathan leaned back in disbelief. It wasn't one disaster. It was dozens. Each institution assuming another one would help. None of them did. Across the city Elena prepared for another interview. A non-profit environmental consulting firm had invited her to speak with the hiring committee. She ironed her only professional blouse inside the shelter laundry room. One sleeve still carried a tiny burn mark from the wildfire years earlier. She couldn't replace it. She simply positioned her jacket so no one would notice. When she arrived, the interview lasted 42 minutes. Everything went well. Her technical knowledge impressed everyone. Her experience exceeded every requirement. Then the final question came. So, what have you been doing these last 3 years? Silence. She answered honestly. I've been surviving. The interviewer's smile faded almost instantly. We'll be in touch. She already knew what those words meant. Late that evening, Jonathan received a phone call. It was the private investigator again. I found something else. What? There was one document Dr. Brooks tried to protect during the fire. The research binder? Yes. It wasn't ordinary research. What was it? It contained a prototype filtration system. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. So? The investigator slid another page across the table. The patent was never completed. Why? Because everything burned before filing. Jonathan scanned the diagrams. His breathing slowed. The design looked strangely familiar. Very familiar. He opened another folder from Mercer Dynamics. A confidential engineering proposal submitted 6 months earlier by one of his own subsidiaries. Different formatting. Different author. But the core technology was nearly identical. Jonathan's expression changed completely. Someone inside his own corporation had built a billion-dollar project on ideas that belonged to Dr. Elena Brooks. And if that was true, everything was about to change. Jonathan Mercer spent the entire night inside his office. The lights of Seattle faded into sunrise while page after page covered the enormous conference table. On one side lay Dr. Elena Brooks' surviving research notes. On the other sat confidential engineering documents from Mercer Dynamics. At first glance they appeared different. Different formatting. Different terminology. Different diagrams. But once Jonathan removed the logos and page numbers, the similarities became impossible to ignore. Entire sequences. Chemical calculations. Flow models. Even one unusual filtration algorithm appeared almost identical. Someone hadn't merely been inspired. Someone had copied. At exactly 7:30 a.m., Jonathan called an emergency executive meeting. No assistants. No department heads. Only 5 senior executives. When they entered the room, Jonathan didn't greet anyone. He simply projected 2 engineering drawings onto the wall. Explain this. Silence. His chief technology officer adjusted his glasses. They're similar. Jonathan looked directly at him. No. They're the same. The room remained silent. Finally, Vice President Richard Lawson cleared his throat. Jonathan. Innovation often builds upon previous work. Jonathan slid another document across the table. This research predates our project by almost 4 years. No one answered. Jonathan continued. Who approved acquisition of these designs? Richard hesitated. We purchased intellectual property from an independent consulting firm. Which firm? North Cascade Environmental Solutions. Jonathan opened another folder. The company was registered 43 days after Dr. Elena Brooks lost her university position. Another pause. Were we aware of her previous research? Richard looked uncomfortable. There were similar publications. Answer the question. Yes. Jonathan's voice became colder. Did anyone attempt to contact Dr. Brooks? No. Did anyone compensate her? No. Did anyone verify ownership? Again. No. The room felt suddenly smaller. Jonathan closed the folder. The acquisition is suspended. Richard immediately protested. We've invested nearly $1 billion. Jonathan stood. Then consider this the most expensive ethics lesson this company has ever received. That afternoon Jonathan drove somewhere he had never expected to visit. Harbor House. The shelter manager looked surprised. You came back. I need to speak with Elena. She's teaching. Jonathan followed children's laughter into a small classroom. There she stood before 12 kids using empty plastic bottles, string, and homemade filters to explain how clean water systems worked. No expensive laboratory. No modern equipment. Only imagination. The children listened as though she were the greatest scientist in the world. Maybe she was. She noticed Jonathan near the doorway. The lesson ended a few minutes later. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. What brings you here? Jonathan took a deep breath. I owe you an apology. She looked confused. For what? For something you don't even know happened. He explained everything. The copied research. The investigation. The billion-dollar project. The silence that had buried her work. Elena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she didn't look angry. She looked tired. I wondered. Jonathan blinked. You knew? She nodded slowly. 2 years ago, I recognized one of my designs in an industry presentation. Why didn't you fight? She smiled sadly. With what money? Which lawyer? Which evidence? I was trying to keep my husband alive. I couldn't fight corporations. Jonathan had negotiated with governments. He had defeated billion-dollar competitors. Yet he had no answer. Because she was right. Justice often belonged to whoever could afford to wait. 3 days later Mercer Dynamics held an emergency press conference. Financial reporters expected news about acquisitions. Instead, Jonathan stepped onto the stage carrying one thin blue research binder. Cameras flashed non-stop. He looked directly into the audience. Today I need to correct a mistake. He explained the investigation. The copied technology. The failures. The company's responsibility. Every television station in Washington broadcast the speech live. Shares of Mercer Dynamics immediately dropped nearly 11%. Investors panicked. Commentators called him reckless. His board demanded an emergency vote. Jonathan ignored every phone call. Then he invited someone onto the stage. Elena Brooks. She froze backstage. I don't belong there. Jonathan smiled. You belonged there years ago. As she stepped beneath the lights, the room became completely silent. Many reporters recognized her name. Few recognized her face. Jonathan handed her the microphone. For several long seconds she couldn't speak. Finally she said only one sentence. I never wanted revenge. I only wanted the truth to survive. The room erupted into applause. Within days the story spread across the country. Universities contacted Elena. Environmental organizations requested meetings. Former students wrote thousands of messages. Scientists from Europe remembered her publications. Journalists uncovered additional evidence proving that multiple companies had quietly built products using concepts from her abandoned research. Federal investigators opened formal inquiries. Mercer Dynamics voluntarily transferred every related patent to Elena's legal ownership. Jonathan also created a new independent research institute. Not in his own name, but in hers. The Elena Brooks Center for Clean Water Innovation. She accepted one condition. No executive offices. No luxury furniture. Every dollar beyond operating costs goes into scholarships. Jonathan laughed. I expected nothing less. 6 months later, the center employed dozens of young scientists. Many came from backgrounds where higher education had once seemed impossible. One afternoon Jonathan visited the laboratory. He found Elena helping interns assemble a prototype with her own hands. You know, he said, smiling, most directors don't build equipment anymore. She looked up. They forget how. They both laughed. Outside the laboratory windows, rain once again fell over Seattle. The same city that had once watched her collect bottles before sunrise. Now people recognized her everywhere. Not because she had become famous again. Because the truth had finally caught up with her. Jonathan often remembered the first morning he saw a woman silently sorting bottles beneath the rain. He had assumed she needed someone to save her. In the end, she reminded an entire industry what integrity looked like. And that lesson was worth far more than $9 billion. The end. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that authenticity is often your greatest strength. See you in the next story.